Good morning. If you would open your Bible to the book of Exodus, chapter 34. This morning we're going to be in verses 10 to 28. We have two more sermons in the book of Exodus, and then we are finished. We've been in this for a little bit over a year now, and I really didn't think we would get through Exodus in this amount of time. I thought it would take us longer, but after these next two sermons, we'll have the Easter service, and then after that, we'll start a new book. I'm not sure yet, but I will announce that in due time. This morning, we're in Exodus 34, verses 10 to 28. The title of the sermon this morning is Be Different. If last week we had talked about God's character and seven qualities or attributes of God, and I purposely last week kind of stayed away from how that applied to us and just wanted us to focus on God and who He was and what we should do with that. But this week the sermon is predominantly about what we need to do and who we need to be. And so that's the kind of how we're going to structure it this morning. So let's pray, and we'll read the text as we kind of go through the sermon this morning. So if you will open in a word of prayer with me. God, we do stand in awe of you, Lord, as we have just sung, and even if that's not true of us this morning, God, I pray that you would make it true. That you would give us a picture of your glory, Lord, that maybe we don't have right now or won't have today, and that you would help us to see that picture and to stand in awe of you, God. Stand in awe of the God that you are, a God who is merciful and gracious and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness and forgiving and just and many more characteristics, God, that we would stand in awe that you are these things to us and more. And because you are these things, that you have called us to be your people, to look different, to be different. And I pray, Lord, that you'd help us to accept that and to live that this morning, this year, in our life. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Trip Lee, who is a hip-hop artist and a pastor in Atlanta, Georgia, writes this or says this: we should stop being so surprised, and we have to fall out of love with being cool and being liked by everybody. Because at the end of the day, it's not going to be cool to really pursue Jesus with everything you have. It's not. And so we have to be okay with the fact that we won't be the ones that the culture looks to as the coolest, or even our day and age the nicest. They're going to really speak out against a lot of the things that we do. But we also have to be compassionate and not combative, because the temptation is going to be that they are fighting me. Let me fight back. One of our greatest fears is being different, standing out, because it's uncool. It's different. It goes against the grain, and whether that's at our job and our family and friends, we're so afraid to look different and be different, and yet it's the universal call of every Christian to be different. So this morning we're going to look at God's call to the people of Israel to be different and how we can apply that to ourselves as New Testament Christians. So I'm going to give us 7 ways that God calls us to be different from this text. And with each of these, I'm going to give an Old Testament explanation, how God was calling His people of Israel to be different. And then I'm going to give a New Testament application in which God calls us as Christians to be different. All right? So that's where we're going. 7 ways God calls us to be different. Number 1, God calls us to be different in our friendships and family. God calls us to be different in our friendships and family. Let me start with an Old Testament explanation. Look at Exodus 34, verses 10 to 12, if you'll read it with me in your Bible. And he said, "Behold, I am making a covenant before all your people. I will do marvels such as not been done, created in all the earth or any nation. And all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. Now God is meeting with Moses on top of Mount Sinai, and after proclaiming to Moses who he was, we looked at that last week, God reminds Moses that the law that he's given to him is not simply some rules and regulations to follow. We often think of the law as that, just rules and regulations to follow. God says that's not just what it is. This is a covenant that God is making with his people. Look at verse 10. He says it right there. He said, behold, I'm making a covenant. God had made a covenant previously with Noah. He had made a covenant with Abraham. And now God is establishing a covenant with Moses and with the nation of Israel. And this was a covenant where God basically said, you will be mine and I will be yours. You will obey me and I will take care of you. And it was a good covenant. Now, sure, yes, it came with 613 laws, right? And that kind of seems burdensome, but it also came with a God who loved them. It also came with a God who would do marvels among them, a God who would do awesome things among them, a God who would drive out all their enemies before them. This was a good covenant that God was giving them. And so God says in verse 12 here, take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land that I'm sending you. Now God says there, take care, or as the New American Standard Translation puts it, watch yourself. I think it's a better translation. God says, watch yourself that you don't make a covenant with the people of the land. Now, why does God tell them not to make a covenant with the people of the land? Is he jealous? Actually, we find out that he is jealous in verse 14, and rightfully so. But here in verse 12, God gives a different reason that he doesn't want them to make a covenant. God says, if you make a covenant with the people, it will be a snare in your midst. Now, what's a snare? It's a trap. You know what the problem is with a trap? Is that it's a trap. It looks so promising, so inviting, so rewarding up front, but it bites horribly in the end. That's the problem. God says, don't make a covenant with the nations around you, because if you do, it will prove to be a trap to you. And what's our application to this? Well, we first have to ask, why did God give this command to the people to not make a covenant with the other nations? Partly because he's a jealous God, partly because they already have a covenant with God. But here in verse 12, God says, don't make a covenant because it will be a trap to you people. Now, how would it trap them? Douglas Stewart writes that in the ancient world that Israel inhabited, any binding agreement with pagans involved either legitimizing pagan gods, in whose name the other nation would be acting and making a treaty with Israel, and in demoting Yahweh to the level of other gods, since most covenant treaties were parity covenants in which parties related to each other and implicitly to their God on equal terms. What Stewart is basically arguing is that a covenant with the nations would cause the Israelites to compromise on their covenant with God. Now, we don't have a direct application here. We're not a theocracy. We're not, making covenants with Mexico or Canada or even with our family and friends. I mean, you make a covenant with marriage, that might have a direct application there, but we don't make covenants like this anymore. So how can we apply this? Here's the question that I think we need to ask of ourselves. Here it is. Is there any friendship with a friend, a coworker, a classmate, a family member that causes us to compromise with our covenant with God? Is there any friendship that you have that causes you to compromise on your walk with God? Now, let me go on a quick clarification trip because I've always got to give clarifications on this. I am not preaching abstention from the world. I'm not. We need to be in the world. We need to engage the world. We are the only salt and light of the world. All right? So I'm not preaching Christian bubbleism. It's not what I'm preaching here. I'm simply asking, is there any friendship whatsoever that you have in your life that is causing you to compromise on your covenant with God if you are a Christian? And look, be careful not to get defensive here. To immediately be like, I'm not compromising. I'm not compromising. Remember, the thing about a trap is that it doesn't look like a trap. If a trap looks like a trap, it's a bad trap. So be careful to kind of think that I'm not compromising here, because that's the danger of a trap. Now, so you might say, how do I know? How do I know if I am compromising? Here's the best way that I know to discern this. All right? Not the only way. Here's the best way that I know to discern this. Here's the question. Who's setting the pace in our relationships with the world? Is it us or is it them? That's the question. Who is setting the pace? Is it us or is it them? We have a New Testament principle. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? Now, we often apply this to relationships, to dating relationships and to marriages, and rightfully so. But the most immediate and direct application of this is not relationships and marriage. It is friendships. It is who we hang out with. And we can't say that Paul is arguing, don't engage the world. Paul engaged the world constantly. He was always in the world. Paul lived a life of engaging the world. So, engage the world, but solely for the purpose of being salt and light. That is the sole purpose of your engaging the world. If that's not your purpose and motivation for hanging out with the world, we need to get our priorities straight. God calls us to be different in our friendships with, and even in our family. That's true for our family as well. Be salt and light to your family. 2, God calls us to be different in what we run after. Let me give an Old Testament explanation. Look at verse 13 to 15 and verse 17. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Asherim, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited to eat of his sacrifice. Then down to verse 17, you shall not make for yourself any gods of cast metal. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this explanation because I've already preached sermons on the topics of idolatry and God's jealousy from the book of Exodus. And if you're interested in hearing those, you can find them on YouTube. September 13th, I preached, is it right for God to be jealous? And then on December 27th, preached on the attractions of idolatry. All right, so I'm not going to rehash all of that information. You can go online and check it out if you want. But in those 2 sermons, we concluded that it is right for God to be jealous. Why? Because to love somebody means to desire and pursue their objective best. And God says, I am your objective best. So God's jealousy does not flow out of insecurity or pride, but actually out of love. God's jealousy flows out of his abounding love for his people. He is their objective best. The problem is that idolatry is attractive. That's the problem. These altars and these pillars and these Asherim poles were attractive. They still are. Idolatry is still attractive because everybody around them was running after them. The ancients believed in a multiplicity of gods, everyone being a specialist in some aspect of world or nature. Therefore, the ancients found it enormously attractive to think that they could gain assured access to these gods through idols. It was unthinkable to most ancients to believe that only one God could be God. So you can imagine that they would think, or maybe even today, why would we only go after one God? Why would I do that? Everybody else is going after multiple gods. And look how prosperous they are. Look how successful they are. It works. It makes sense. Maybe we should do it. Maybe we should run after these gods. So what's our New Testament application there? God says you be different in what you run after. And guys, I get that this is hard, right? You walk up to somebody and say, kill the idol. This is hard. It is hard to kill idols. One of the biggest things that God has been doing in my life over the past, 6 months or so, has been how I view playing sports. And I've been talking to my wife about this a lot, and I love playing sports. I played sports all my life. I've very much found my identity in playing sports and how good I was or thought I was. And over the past 6 months, God has been stripping that and breaking that down. And here's the problem, is that I find that when I find my identity in sports, I score like 30 points plus. When I don't find my identity in sports, I score like 3 points. Because I don't care. I'm not running after it. I'm not striving for it. For me to do well, I have to find my identity in it. That's the only way I know how to do well at it. And the moment I take that away, I do poorly. And I'm like, I feel caught between these two worlds of, but I want to do well. And maybe for you, it's, but I want to get promoted. I want to get this. I want to get that. And if I don't find my identity in it, it's hard for me to do well in this. I get that that's hard. That is difficult. Because to find your identity in Christ might mean giving up what you love, what you value most. Jesus said no one can serve two masters. For either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. Everybody around you may be running after gods of success and popularity and power and influence and friends and buying power and possessions and status and recognition and comfort and luxury and sports and entertainment and vacations. And none of those are wrong in and of themselves. It's just that you can't run after them and God at the same time. We can't serve them and God at the same time. We can't run after them, meaning we can't give our full attention, affection, devotion, love for them and God at the same time. And listen, don't believe the lie that you can still serve God and serve this. Because Jesus, clear as day, says you cannot. No one can serve two masters. God calls us to be different in what we run after. Point number 3. Now, point number 3 is for you singles, but it applies to you married as well in terms of how you give counsel to others. Point number 3, God calls us to be different in our relationships and our marriages. Look at verse 16 here. And you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods. Now, in the Old Testament, God forbid His people to marry outside of the covenant community. Now, this was not a matter of race. It was not a matter of ethnicity. Boaz married Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite, but she had joined the covenant community. So it's not a matter of race or ethnicity. The reason that God gives for His people to not marry outside the covenant community is that the one who is polytheistic will influence the one who is monotheistic. That's why. Now we might ask, and we often do, I've been asked this at least a dozen times in the past 5 years, couldn't it work the other way around? Couldn't the one who's monotheistic influence the one who's polytheistic? It's interesting because God doesn't even give that as a possibility. God just says, don't do it. He doesn't even give that as a possibility. Now, to answer the question, couldn't it work the other way around? Just to answer the question, yes, it's possible, but highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. Let me give you a kind of an illustration on this. Suppose you married somebody and you are a workout fanatic. Healthy, love to work out. And the person you married, though, is not a workout fanatic. In fact, they love to cook. And they like to cook like Paula Deen, with a stick of butter and everything. And they are a good cook. And they do it every day. And they're making meals and making desserts. And now, do you think that your workoutness is going to influence them, or they're going to influence you? I guarantee you they're going to influence you. Why? Because it's an easier standard. The one with the harder standard is always exponentially more difficult to influence the other person. The one with the lower standard is going to be the one who influences the one with the higher standard. That's just human nature. And God says, don't do it. Don't marry outside the covenant community. We see that God was right. We see that when God gave this command, He was right. I'm going to give you 3 quick examples. All right, here they are. Number 1, Numbers 25. When Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to the Baal of Peor. Now I want us to notice the connection there. In Numbers 25, it said the people invited them to their sacrifices. In Exodus 34:15, look what God says. He says, they will invite you to their sacrifices. Don't yoke yourself, because they're going to invite you and you're going to be like, oh, well, I mean, you're having a roast? I guess I could go. And they go. And they whore themselves to the Baals. Now, if we think, well, that won't be me. All right, I'll be smart about this. I'll be wise. I'm wise. That won't happen to me. Solomon, who was perhaps the second wisest man ever to live, apart from Jesus. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughters of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women. Brother didn't discriminate. All right. From the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart from the Lord. For all the wisdom in the world, women got him. And I'll give you one other. Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah goes commando on people. I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them, pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of the God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons for yourself. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was beloved by God. God made him king over all of Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him. See, Nehemiah says, even Solomon, the wisest man on the planet, fell prey to this. Shall we then listen to you and do this great evil and treacherous against our God by marrying foreign women? God calls us to be different in our relationships and in our marriages. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, so I'm just going to give you one principle. And here's the one principle you need to abide by. Christian ladies, you want a man who runs after Jesus more than he runs after you. Don't settle for anything less. Christian men, you want a lady who runs after Jesus more than she runs after you. Don't settle for anything less. And married people, challenge those in your challenge. If you love them, to abide by this standard. Those who are Christians, if they're lost, they can marry whoever they want. 4, God calls us to be different in our conveniences. Look at verse 18. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread 7 days. You shall eat unleavened bread as I commanded you. At the time appointed in the month of Abib, from the month of Abib, you came out of Egypt. This feast of unleavened bread was set up in Exodus 12, 14 to 15. Let me read that for you. It'll be on the screen. This day shall be for you a memorial day. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations as a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses, for if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Now notice, this was a serious punishment. If you ate leaven during the feast of unleavened bread, you were cut off from your people. That's a serious punishment. Now, this was an inconvenience for them. It was. Bread to them is like rice or corn to us. They ate it every day. Bread without leaven is not appetizing. You guys are here on the first of the month, if you know what I mean. Leaven helps it taste better, more pleasant to eat. It's more filling. But God wanted them to eat unleavened bread for 7 days straight, every year, for the rest of their life. That's 2% of their days. 2% of their life, they have to eat bread that doesn't taste very good. And God commanded this not just to inconvenience them. God commanded this so that they would remember God, remember His protection, remember His provision. God was the one who brought them out of Egypt, not them. God was the one who gave them bread. When they get into the promised land, they're going to start to get wealthy. They're going to start to get comfortable. They're going to start building houses and kind of settling in. And it's going to be all too easy to forget about God. And God says, for 1 week out of the year, you celebrate this to remember me, even though it's inconvenient. This is not the only inconvenience that God commands them. God commands them to live in tiny little booths. They actually had to build a tiny little shack once a year for 7 days straight and live in a booth called the Feast of Booths. God gives them certain fasts that they have to abide by. In verse 28, Moses is fasting right here. Moses is fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank, neither ate nor drank. Now, I assume that was supernatural, but you still would feel hunger for 40. Can you imagine feeling hungry for 40 days straight? That is really inconvenient. God commanded them to travel to Jerusalem. They had to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem. That's really inconvenient. It's so much easier to go sacrifice at the high place. I don't want to have to go to Jerusalem. And so on and so on. God calls us to be different in our conveniences. Now listen, we live in a culture where we rarely, if ever, seek out to be inconvenienced. Smartphones were created in part to be a convenience. Social media was in part created to be a social convenience. We even have convenience stores that you can run in and get a Slurpee and beef jerky. We get angry if you have to click too many times on a website. You ever try to buy something? You're like, man, this is too many clicks. Used to be you had to get in a car and go drive there and shop for it. And now it's like, 5 clicks. Starbucks now has the capability to order your drink ahead of time, so you don't have to be inconvenienced to wait in line. You can just show up, thank you very much. We love conveniences. We love them. We seek them out. I do. I'm no different. I seek out conveniences. So what do we do when we come to a God who says, pray? Pray. That seems so inconvenient. Read the Bible. Is there a video I can watch? Meet with people. Like on Facebook? Defend the faith. Fast. Share the gospel. I mean, all of these commands and more are just massive inconveniences. But God has called us to be different in our conveniences. Listen to me. To have a walk with God, to have a vital relationship with the body of Christ, to carry out the mission of God, not only do we have to be willing to be inconvenienced, we actually have to seek out inconveniences. You have to actually go out of your way to seek out to be inconvenienced, to have a vital walk with God. There's no other way around it. There is no app for holiness or godliness. Be different than the world. Look different than the world in how willing you are to be inconvenienced. 5, God calls us to be different in our assets. Look at verse 19 and 20. All that open the womb are mine, all your male livestock, the firstborn of the cow and the sheep. The firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. Then look at verse 26. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. If you remember, God had killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. All right? Both human and animal. He killed all Egyptian firstborn and firstborn animals. But God in His mercy was willing to spare the Israelite firstborn. And because of this, God said, because I spared them, they're all mine now. Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and beast, is mine. So because of God's mercy, God declares all firstborn are now mine. However, there's a problem with this. People need their animals, and they want their children, right? So God makes a plan for them to be able to redeem their firstborn animal and the firstborn child so that they can keep them. They may redeem them. Now, this would typically take the form of a monetary payment. So rather than giving the firstborn cow or sheep to God, I could essentially buy it back from God. I could buy my sheep and my cow back from God. And the same for children as well. All right? Now, in certain cases, the child was not redeemed and was fully given over to God. This is what happened with Samuel. Remember, Hannah prays to God and says, God, if you will open my womb and give me a child, I'll give my child to you. And she does. God opens her womb, gives her a child, and she gives Samuel fully over to the Lord. And he serves in the temple the rest of his life and becomes a prophet. But typically, you would bring a monetary payment to God to redeem the firstborn. This is why God says at the end of verse 20, nobody shall appear before me empty-handed. Everybody must come with a payment to redeem your firstborn. You could either give your animal to God or you could buy it back. The same for your child. This even applied in a different sense in fruits and vegetables. Look at verse 26. The best of your first fruits you shall give to me. What God is essentially saying is that the crop farmer could do no less than the animal farmer. The crop farmer had to bring God the best of his crops, not the leftovers. The other day, we saw a sign when we were driving down Coal Creek, and it said, 10 pounds of apples for $10. And I was like, that's $1 a pound. I went to math class. And I was like, man, even at Sam's, which has like the cheapest prices, it's like $1.75 a pound. And I was like, $1 a pound for apples? You could even get 25 pounds for $15. I was like, what am I doing with 25 pounds of apples? Now, when we got there and we bought them, we quickly realized why they were $1 a pound. Because like one apple was like this big, and then one was like this big, and they had like little imperfections and bruises and stuff like that. It was from a local farmer. And, when you go to the grocery store and you buy a bag of apples, they're all uniform, right? Because somebody has already like vetted them, and it's like this one, they all need to be kind of a certain size and no deformities or anything like that. What God is saying here is that when you have a crop, you can't like lay it all out and be like, good, good, bad, 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 good, good. All right, let's give these ones to God. Let's give the ones that like we don't really want, like the bruised ones, the ones that are like, let's save the best. Like, oh man, this tomato is so perfect. It's so ripe. Like I want to eat it right now. And no. God doesn't even, he doesn't even eat tomatoes. God says, you give to me first and you give to me your best. You can't take out the best and give me the leftovers. No presents from the basement. God said, you give to me first and you give to me best. Now, what's our New Testament application? God calls us to be different in our assets. I get asked about giving all the time. So there's so much I could say about this. So I'm going to make a statement. All right? It's going to be way too dogmatic for some of you. But hear me out because I'll give some disclaimers. Here's the statement. If you don't regularly give financially and over a period of time show very little to no desire to give, I would consider if you knew Jesus. Let me say that again. If you don't regularly give financially and over a period of time show very little to no desire to give, I would consider if you knew Jesus. God has called us to be different in our assets. There is so much in the Bible about giving that it's hard to believe that you could be a Christian and not give. There's so much in the Bible about giving. Now, disclaimers. Need disclaimers with these kind of statements. If you notice in my statement, I left a lot of room for ambiguity and subjectivity, right? How much you give, how often, to whom, how long is that period of time? Listen, I can't answer those questions. I can't. I won't and I can't. Here's how I will answer. I'll give you an illustration. Here's how I will answer. I would love to eat filet mignon and lobster every night of my life. I have this running joke with Lauren. She asked me, like, Matt, what do you want for dinner? And I always say filet mignon. And I'm like, you have to give me options. You know, like, what do we have? Peanut butter and jelly, cereal, tuna melt. So I always answer that, you know. I would love to eat filet mignon and lobster. I could. I make enough money where I could eat filet mignon and lobster every night, but my kids wouldn't eat. We wouldn't have any money left over for them. So I don't. I eat peanut butter and jelly almost every day of my life. And here's the truth. It's not a sacrifice for me. It's not. Not just because I like peanut butter and jelly, but it's not. Why is it not? Because I love my kids. I love my kids. Now here's my question. Do you love God? More than you love what you want? Listen, is whatever you gain by holding on to that 10%, 12%, 15%, whatever that is, whatever that, you work that out between you and God, is whatever you gain by holding on to that worth more than your love for God? Is it? I think that if I ate filet mignon and lobster every night of my life to the detriment of my children, you would come to me and say, Matt, do you love your kids? And I think you'd be justified in asking me that. And I think, I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I think that a Christian who doesn't give should be questioned. Do you love God? Do you love God? Now, God doesn't need our money. My kids need to eat. God doesn't need our money. But He has called us to be different in our assets. He's called us to live differently in our assets. 6, God calls us to be different in our work-rest balance. Look at verse 21. 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. In plowing time and harvest you shall rest. Again, we've already talked about the Sabbath laws and the rest, so I'm not going to rehash all of that. However, God adds something here in Exodus 34 that He didn't add in Exodus 20 and Exodus 16. He says, in plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. Now, why does God add this? I like what Douglas Stewart writes. He says, plowing and planting, harvesting and reaping are the two most intense times in a farmer's life. The temptation to work 7 days weeks is very strong during these seasons, since plowing and harvesting at the right time can be essential to crop productivity, and beating the weather can seem to necessitate taking no time off during these crucial periods. That is, working through Sabbath days. But the combination of work and rest provided by the Sabbath was more important to God, and should have been more important to the worshiper, than farm productivity. In other words, the concept of responding to an emergency, such as constituted by the need to rescue an animal from a pit on the Sabbath, Luke 14:5, cannot be extrapolated to suggest that maximizing one's potential for a good crop constitutes a similar emergency and therefore could justify working on the Sabbath day. What Stewart is suggesting there is that, look, let's not be legalistic about the Sabbath. We should not be legalistic about the Sabbath. If the proverbial ox falls into the ditch, go get it out. If your neighbor is broken down on the side of the road on the Sabbath, go help your neighbor. However, getting ahead at work, making more profit, catching up on work or schoolwork does not fall in the category of an ox falling in a ditch. They're not the same. So what's our New Testament application? God calls us to be different in our work-rest balance. The problem is the rise of technology. We have the capability to work 7 days a week, and not only to work 7 days a week, to work 24 hours a day, to burn the midnight oil every single night if we want, to never stop and realize we are finite. We need rest. And I know this is challenging for many of you, right? Because you might work in a culture, or you might go to school in a culture where it's, many of you have jobs where it's like, look, here's the deal. This is what the contract should read. You give us your life, and we'll give you a paycheck. That's what the contract should read. I realize that many of you work at a job like that. We watch this show called Shark Tank once a week on Saturday nights. And their entrepreneurs come in, they try to get a deal from a shark, from an investor. And they always ask them, like, is this your full-time job? And most of them it is, but every now and then it'll be like a mom or a dad, and they'll be like, no, I also work here, or I'm a mom. And typically, if anybody has a family, like I have 3 kids and I take care of them, they don't get the deal. You know why they don't get the deal? Because the shark says, your time's going to be split, and there's somebody else out there who's working harder than you. There's going to be somebody else out there who's going to, if you're working 18 hours a day, there's somebody working 19. And I always feel so bad because it's like, so because they have kids, they can't be a successful entrepreneur? Because they have a life outside of their work, they can't be successful in their job? Is that what we've come to as a society? The reality is it is. Be different in your work-rest balance. Now, you notice I didn't say work-life balance because life can seem like work. Life can be anything. Life can be paying bills and catching up with chores around the house. Be different in your work-rest balance. Have time set apart where you simply rest and spiritually rest. Not sleep necessarily, spiritually rest in the Lord. Number 7, God calls us to be different in where we put our trust. My favorite Old Testament command, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. I love this command for 2 reasons. Number 1, because it's so random, or it seems so random. It's always inserted somewhere where it seems to make no sense. And I wonder, were people asking Moses to do this? Like, hey, Moses, we really want to boil a goat and it's your mother's milk. Can we do that? Were they asking him this? Because 2, it's repeated 3 times. Out of all the things that could be said in the Bible, God saw fit to repeat this command 3 times. So why does God give this command? Here's why, I think. The theory goes like this. The Canaanites practiced this cooking method. Why? Because they knew that a mother's milk is what made a young doe grow. And so they're like, milk makes it grow. So if we boil it in milk, it might impart fertility to the whole flock. That's how they thought. And to make matters worse, if that really happened, if they did boil a young goat in its mother's milk and they did have a fertile flock, they would think it worked. It does impart fertility to the flock. And God says, you are to have no part of this. Why? Because the temptation would be for the people to seek out other means of productivity and success and blessing apart from Yahweh. Especially when times are tough, especially when they're in a famine. I mean, if you're in a famine or a trial and you're like, nothing's working, God's not listening to us, well, maybe we should start boiling goats in mother's milk. Maybe that'll give us a fertile flock. Well, it's worth a try. Couldn't hurt. And God says, don't do that. God calls us to be different in where we place our trust. Listen, I understand it is so difficult to believe that prayer works. You have a problem, you have an issue, you have a trial. The tendency is to want to turn to research. You know, get on Google, start figuring it out. Go to people, work harder. I just need to work harder. If I just work harder, my problems will be solved. Saving more? Now, none of those are bad. None of those are bad. But sometimes to have faith that none of those will work apart from prayer is difficult. It is difficult to believe that sometimes God cares more about me knowing Him than His plans. You know, because we want to go to God and be like, God, what's your plan? What's your purpose? What do you have for me? And to believe, maybe God doesn't want to tell us His plans right now. Maybe He just wants me to know Him. That's difficult to believe. It's difficult to believe that obeying God every single time will actually make me happier. The tendency to believe that I know what will make me happy. But to have the faith to believe that obedience always leads to joy. God calls us to be different in where we place our trust. All obedience and all matters of life go back to this one central question. Do we trust God? You can boil everything down in life to that one question. Do we trust God? The world is placing their trust in their 401ks, their jobs, their spouses, their family, their assets, their talent, their degrees, their ability to secure some piece of this life. As Christians, God has called us to be different. Be different in where you place your trust.